Into the boats. How did they know where they were? Since the outset of their voyage through featureless ocean and anonymous ice pack, the officers and crew of Endurance had been able to track their exact location and chart their zigzagging progress on their maps. This was before the use of radio signals to plot position, before radar, before satellites. They used a few basic instruments, some almanacs, and math. For centuries, map makers, astronomers, and navigators have marked the globe with imaginary lines of latitude, which are parallel to the equator and are often called parallels, and lines of longitude, also called meridians, great circles that all run through the north and south poles. The meridians are perpendicular to the parallels on the surface of the globe. That is, they meet at right angles, or 90 degrees. When a navigator knows his coordinates, the degree of latitude and degree of longitude he is at, he knows where on the wide blank ocean he is. But how does he know the latitude and longitude? Astronomers have long known that the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars, follow regular and predictable paths through the heavens. And centuries of patient nighttime observation have produced detailed almanacs listing the daily positions of these bodies. As a navigator moves further north or south, the height of a star above the horizon changes. Using an instrument called a sextant, the navigator can measure the height of the star above the horizon. Then, by referring to the almanacs and making some calculations, he can determine how far north or south he is. That is his latitude. No matter where on the globe the observer is, an accurate measurement of that star's height or altitude and the use of proper almanacs or tables will provide latitude. Longitude proved to be a harder puzzle to solve. Astronomers have known for centuries that the Earth takes 24 hours to complete one full rotation, one day. Because a circle, one rotation is 360 degrees, it is possible to divide 360 by 24 to find out how many degrees the Earth spins in just 1 hour. The answer is 15 degrees. Imagine with that information, longitude is within reach, assuming accurate clocks. Imagine a traveler going west with two clocks. After several days, it is no longer noon when the clocks say 12. So the traveler adjusts the first clock to read 12 when it is noon where he is. The second clock tells a different time, the time at the starting point. If the difference in time is 1 hour, the traveler knows he has gone 15 degrees. He can continue to travel as long as he wants, always resetting the first clock at noon when the sun is at its highest point in the sky. As long as he continues to wind the second clock, and as long as it is accurate, he will know the time difference between his present position and his starting point. He can then convert the difference in time to a distance in degrees. This makes accurate clocks indispensable on ocean voyages, but it wasn't until the 18th century that accurate clocks became a reality. In 1714, the British Parliament offered a prize to the person who could solve the longitude puzzle. Decades later, the prize was awarded to a clockmaker, John Harrison. The mechanism of Harrison's chronometer could withstand the turbulent motion of a ship at sea, defy changes of temperature, and resist the corrosion of salt water and air. His first three models were large, clumsy, heavy instruments, but his final masterpiece was not much larger than a heavy pocket watch. Any captain could take such a timekeeper to sea with him. Harrison had solved the problem of fixing longitude. By 1914, when Endurance set sail from London, dependable and accurate chronometers were every skipper's constant companions. Armed with sextant, chronometers, compass, and nautical tables, Frank Worsley, skipper of Endurance, had been able to calculate and plot their every position. He was able to judge the pack's rate of travel by comparing positions from one day to the next. He knew how far they were from the nearest land. He knew when they had crossed the Antarctic Circle. He knew how many miles of forbidding ocean still lie between the crew and their home. Of course, there were many days on the ice when getting a sight from the heavens was impossible. Fog, cloud cover, blizzard conditions, rain, and foul weather of every description often hid the sun and stars from Worsley's sight. But whenever the sun made an appearance, he was sure to take as many readings as he could. The big box chronometers on the ship had been abandoned at dump camp, but Worsley had chronometer watches. He periodically checked their accuracy by taking a kind of astronomical reading called an occultation. Most astronomers use the moon or the major planets for their occultations. Worsley used tiny Mercury once, just for swank, to show he could do it. Nobody liked to think what might happen if Worsley lost any of instruments or tables. After Shackleton, they looked to the skipper to get them home. How else would they find their way? Now, after the initial excitement of the ocean swell, the men began to grow even more restless. For several days, the pack closed in tight again, and they could no longer detect the movement of the ocean. But they knew it was out there, not far. The weather was growing fouler every day as the Antarctic winter approached, with hard frost and cold rain. Ice began to build up under the sledge runners beneath the boats, and the crew had to shift the boats from one side to another to keep them from freezing in place. They had to be ready to launch at any moment. Every morning, they lashed up and stowed their gear. But the ice around them still didn't open. On March 23rd, they spied land to the west, probably one of the danger islands at the entrance to Erebus and Terror Gulf, a scanty 57 miles away. "If the ice opens, we could land in a day," Hurley lamented in his diary. Yet the ice pack, with Patience Camp and its 28 frustrated and helpless men, drifted past. The men busied themselves with repairs to clothing and equipment, readying themselves for the next stage of the journey. Now, there were always at least 2 men on watch as the stubborn ice began eroding. A biting southerly gale intensified the cold at the same time that the blubber supply ran alarmingly low. Hot food was limited to once a day. The other meals were cold and comfortless. 4 days after Patience Camp passed the Danger Islands, icebergs began bulldozing through the pack. The bergs, with their deep bottoms caught in opposing currents, crashed in zigzagging paths through the ice as far as the men could see. Horrified, the crew of Endurance watched as one large berg began plowing in slow motion toward their position. Huge blocks of ice tumbled out of its path, and large floes were churned into chunks. Some of the men swallowed hard and shook hands with their mates. They all knew that if the berg plowed through their camp, there would be no hope of survival, and trying to get out of its unpredictable path was pointless. Shackleton scratched a match alight with his thumbnail, then lit a cigarette as the rogue iceberg blundered toward them. The men watched it come closer and closer, breathing a sigh of relief when it veered away and passed them to the east. They were spared for now. As March continued, the weather turned to rain and then to snow, and the men crawled into their damp sleeping bags in complete, wretched misery. They were hungry, cold, and frightened. Fights broke out for their flimsiest reasons. Some men cried, their tears freezing on their bearded cheeks. The icemen began to believe that they would never be released from their prison. Shackleton did what he could to encourage his men, going from one tent to the next and asking how they were, or starting conversations on topics totally unrelated to their present dangers. Then, during the early morning hours of March 28th, their floe split in half. "Crack!" came a yell from Cheatham, on watch. "Lash up and stow!" As the men struggled out of their tents, they saw 2 cracks running through their floe. The edges rose and fell in a strong swell. Each man knew his emergency orders. Some dashed to the boats and began heaving and cracking them out of the night's ice. Others broke down the camp and began stowing tents and gear. Macklin rounded up his team of dogs, the last of the dogs, and got them in order. Some of the men saw with alarm that their seal meat supply was on a piece of floe that was beginning to drift away in the heavy mist. So they jumped the widening crack and began tossing the meat over. Once all the men and gear were safe on the same piece of floe with the boats, they began to relax, only to have another crack split directly under the James Caird. Another scramble in the chilly, damp morning followed. Finally, they dared to eat a cold breakfast. Just as they were finishing, a leopard seal loomed through the mist, launching itself across the ice. Wild ran for his rifle and brought the seal down with one bullet. And when the 11-foot-long animal was butchered, the men discovered 50 undigested fish inside its stomach. Minutes earlier, the crew had been on short rations eaten cold. Now, they had 1,000 pounds of meat and at least 2 weeks' worth of blubber. Shackleton announced they would make a holiday feast on the seal's liver at lunchtime. And yet, in spite of the new bounty of food, it was time for the last dogs to go. It was obvious to everyone that the pack was breaking up all around them, and it would be impossible to take the dogs in the boats. Macklin harnessed his team for the last time and drove them some distance from the camp with Wild. Sick with regret, Macklin took his dogs one by one from harness. Wild took each unsuspecting animal behind a hummock of ice and quickly put a bullet in its brain. Then Macklin skinned and butchered the dogs for meat and brought them back to camp. Later, as the men feasted on the dogs, Worsley commented that the piece he was eating had a better flavor than the leopard seal, and Hurley found it exquisitely tender and flavorous. As Hurley later wrote, a casual observer might think the explorer a frozen-hearted individual, especially if he noticed the mouths watering when tears ought to be expected. Hunger brings us all to the level of other species, and our saying that sledge dogs are born for work and bred for food is but the rational of experience. Overhead, terns and cape pigeons wheeled and a giant snow petrel flew on snow-white wings. The birds were a sure sign that open water was near. In an open lead of water, Clark spotted some jellyfish, another sign of open ocean. They were very close. Shackleton now ordered the men to keep watch for hours on and for hours off, and to sleep fully dressed in boots, mittens, and hats. The men lie down to sleep on a floe that rose and fell at least a foot with the swell, and some of them felt seasick after so long on a motionless, frozen ocean. Our little boats may be compelled any day now to sail unsheltered over the open sea, Shackleton wrote in his diary, with 1,000 leagues of ocean separating them from the land to the north and east. It seems vital that we should land on Clarence Island or its neighbor, Elephant Island. These islands to the northwest were at the very end of the Antarctic Peninsula. Beyond them lie the open ocean. If the crew did not reach one of the islands, their chances of survival were very small. The days continued to wear on, and their flow continued to erode. By April 3rd, it was only 200 yards across, surrounded by open water and continually bumping into our other floes. The sounds of the ice grinding and crushing, creaking and cracking, filled the cold, damp air all around them. All around them, too, were signs that the Antarctic winter was fast approaching. There were now 12 hours of darkness, and during the daylight hours, petrels and terns fled toward the north. Squaws kept up a screeching clamor, and penguins on the move honked and brayed from the ice for miles around. Killer whales cruised the open leads, blowing spouts of icy spray. The tricks of the Antarctic atmosphere brought mock suns and green sunsets and showers of jewel-colored ice crystals. The floe beneath Patience Camp cracked again and again over the next several days. By April 8th, there were open leads of black water on all sides, and the floe was rising and falling 3 feet with the ocean swell. The ice pack, as far as the eye could see, was rippling with it, like a box of giant jigsaw puzzle pieces being stirred by a giant hand. The floe was now a mere 50 yards across. The voyagers had traveled 600 miles since Endurance was first trapped in the ice. At 12:40 on April 8th, Shackleton gave the order, "Launch the boats!"